Hello, everyone. Welcome to a discussion of The Wars of Light and Shadow by Janny Wurts. And we're going to be talking about Peril's Gate. This is book 6 in the series, The Wars of Light and Shadow. And as usual, I'm joined by my partners in crime here, AP Canavan from A Critical Dragon and Johanna from Johanna Reads. There will be a link to both channels in the description, of course, and I encourage you to check out both of these channels. These are two lovely people that I thoroughly enjoy discussing books with. And unless AP's being nemesis-y at the moment, then I have to put him in his place. But
Well, I think you're about the only person who describes me as lovely.
No.
really, no, no, you are lovely indeed, AP. And I love talking to you about books, especially this series, because this is a series that calls for some, it just begs to be analyzed. There's so much depth. There's so much beauty in this series. The prose is so rich, and I both of you, I enjoy both of your insights, and you two enrich my experience of this series. So thank you so much, and let's get right into Peril's Gate. So Johanna, would you like to go first and give us your general impressions of Peril's Gate?
Okay. So I love that you said that this is worthy of discussion because I am anticipating we're going to have a fantastic discussion on this book. There were so many interesting moments in this book that I thoroughly enjoyed, but also ones that you could look back on and connect the dots in different ways. So I'm really looking forward to that particular part of the discussion.
Yay. Yes,
Mhm.
that's going to be great. Lots happens here. AP, your general impressions?
Once again, like obviously, I greatly enjoy the series. I am a massive fan of the series. I love the writing, and weird enough, this book it occupies this position almost as a fulcrum, as the pivot point around which the entire story is balanced,
Hmm.
because there is a massive sea change that happens in this book. So it's almost like the preceding books were building up in a certain rhythm and structure and style to this moment, which is the key moment when all hell is going to break loose. Things are going to change. Things are going to expand in different directions. The pieces have been laid out. The
Hmm.
um, our anticipation for what is actually going on and how these things are interrelated. All those basic building blocks have been set out. And now we get to this pivot point. And I think for a lot of modern readers, we're not used to stories being told on this grand scale. Like
Hmm.
this is an 11 book series. It's an undecalogue. It's huge, and it's telling one principal story. It is the history of a world. It has all of these interrelated plot threads, but this is one continuous story, this one moment in stretched across time.
Hmm.
And that's a lot. That's a storytelling on such a grand scale. Even when we think of other authors who have written these long epic sagas, quite often each novel or a grouping of novels is telling an element, a section, a thing. But it then follows. Here's the next major thing that led on to it. This gives every impression of everything being connected, which is fascinating, and it does play into structure and all of those things that obviously I'm interested
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like whenever I first heard about this series, I heard conversation about how this series is different. And I was trying to talk about this on Why Read yesterday, how it's different in the sense that it's not an epic fantasy series that is sprawling, like if we want to compare it to Malazan, for example, where we have several continents and characters, though we do get a wonderful array of settings in this series, exploring the world of Athera. It's fascinating in the sense what's different about it or what sets it apart to me is how everything keeps moving outward story-wise, but then harkening back to what preceded it. And it keeps on weaving in and out, like in this spiral or funnel that
The
kind of
gyre.
goes out a little
Yeah.
bit and then comes back. And I just find that the structure of that very unique.
Cool. The gyre structure of the Wars of Light and Shadow. Nice. Neat. Wow. I mean, that's I love that insight, and I heard you talking about it yesterday, Joanna. So yeah.
Doing
Yeah.
my best.
Oh, you did
Fumbling
a
around trying to talk
brilliant
about it.
job. You did a brilliant job, actually. And I have to agree with AP as well. This is, of course, it's literally the book in the middle. There's 5 books that precede it, and there are 5 books that come after it. And I felt that it actually initially felt to me like it was going to repeat the kind of pattern that you had in the first 5 books. And I was saying this to AP earlier, where just I can't do it justice, but I will briefly describe the pattern that we've seen in the first 5 books, which is, you know, like after Curse of the Mistwraith. So books 2, 3, 4, and 5, I think more. But you have Lyser, who's after Arathon, and Arathon has to come up with some new, genius way of getting out of it and not succumbing to the curse. And you have Moriel on the side doing her shenanigans, and you have also we gradually, kind of being drip fed more and more about the Fellowship of the Seven. So it's just kind of like, it felt like to me like there was a pattern to the story each time. And I enjoyed every single one because there were these great variations on it. And Peril's Gate to me started out in a similar manner. But what happened is somewhere in the middle of it, this just exploded. This book for me, it just absolutely transcended what's happened before. And you have a vast spiritual element to this particular. It's like suddenly the whole thing gets transformed into something just bigger. And I am so excited to talk about the specific moments that I have in mind. There are several character journeys that take on a real spiritual aspect in this book, and in ways that I find so transformative for the characters and for the reader as well. So I loved this book, actually. And for me, it was like, okay, this is we're doing something new and different and bigger, and this is really important for, I feel, for the rest of the series, where we might be going. Also pointing to, and this is in terms of the character journeys, but also in terms of the world itself, there are indications here that there are connections to, we already knew there were multiple worlds because Lyser and Arathon came from a different world, Dashan Elur, I think it was called, that splinter world or whatever. And we're mostly in Athera here. But we learn more about the Fellowship of the Seven here. We learn first that Caradmon had a lover at one time, that he was a human, and that this lover had a name that sounded like it could be from our world, right? And then we hear Sethvir. He had a name that sounds like it could be from our world. So I don't know for sure where Janny Wurts is going with this, but it seems that the Fellowship of the Seven, and there have been hints of at a kind of science fiction element to this series before. We've seen that before. So I'm excited to see where, how this develops and branches out. But I feel like Peril's Gate is Janny Wurts planting a flag and saying, all right, you think you know what this is? Now watch, hold my beer, So I'm excited to see what she does after this. But we have so much to talk about here in Peril's Gate. So would you guys like to talk about first I guess, that pattern that I was talking about, maybe in the first part of this, where you have Lyser essentially trying to chase down Arathon, and Arathon having to drive himself further and further in order to evade Lyser, but also evade the Mistwraith that is eating away at him and trying to take over him. So I think maybe that would be a nice way to start, because that is an element in here that we is more from the beginning of the book. So what did you guys think of this latest rendition? And of course, you have other things going on simultaneously. You have Dakar and Luhane and Caradmon trying to keep. Basically, we're dealing with the repercussions of Muriel's really bad idea from the previous books, where she unleashed all kinds of power into the world in an attempt to distract the Fellowship of the Seven, right? But it basically, she could have easily destroyed the world. We found that the Fellowship of the Seven, they're at their limit in trying, and we keep seeing how they really needed more help. They needed the help of Davian, for example, who's doing his own thing in here as well. So lots to talk about. But what about your thoughts on the earliest parts of the book? Johanna, do you want to go first?
I'm trying to remember real specifics here.
Right.
I just remember the council with Cerebel. I can't remember how to say his name.
Oh, Carabel. I
Carabel.
think
Okay,
Carabel.
thank
I
you.
think it's a hard
Yeah.
C. Yeah, yeah,
Yes, and he's giving information using sorcery, using the map to tell him exactly where Arathon is.
yeah,
Also telling Lyser that his son is going to be on this quest journey that is
yeah,
interesting, that leads to a lot of interesting transformations. And yes, it's so Lyser on the one hand is trying to chase down Arathon, and Arathon on the other hand is trying to get away. So obviously, this is a recipe for a lot of conflict to come.
yeah.
That's what I could say, at least about that specific part.
Oh, I like
Um,
that element. We should discuss that for a moment, if you don't mind,
sure,
because
go ahead.
the Carabel portion of the story is directly linked to, of course, what is the name of Lyser's queen or princess that he's married?
Elaine?
Elaine, yes, and she has contrived to disappear, has evaded Carabel and his machinations. So good for her. She's finding out more and more about what happened to her predecessor, who did not actually commit suicide. We know that, and she's
They
discovering
let
this.
her know. They
Yeah, that
purposefully
was a
let her know.
misstep, I think, on Carabel's part, right? Saying, guess what we did to your predecessor, but we're not going to actually give you the evidence because we can't have you accusing us of this. But that's a threat. He's making a threat to her, right?
Control by fear. Yes.
And trying to, he doesn't like her son either. And her son is sent off. Let's talk about him because his
Mhm.
threat is a bit separate here. Do you want to say, before I give it over to AP, do you want to say anything about Lyser's son and his transformation, his thread in this book, which I found to be really compelling in many ways.
Mm. Phoenix. That's the word that comes to my mind. I feel like
Yeah,
he's like a phoenix in this story.
yeah.
I an incredible character. I appreciated that this particular character, you saw signs of him questioning Lysair at the beginning, even prior to his transformation, to getting burned. And of course, we did see seeds along the way that he was going to get saved. So I feel like there was a lot of uh, clues there and that he was going to survive this thing.
Hmm.
But and that the fellowship was onto that and they were planting that with the talisman that was offered to him.
Yes. Yeah.
But what I his journey, and so you were talking about how there's a lot of spiritual transformation in this series.
Right.
He's immediately what comes to mind. I mean, there are a few characters that come to mind when you say that,
Yeah.
but Kever is a standout to me. I immediately attached myself to him. I loved him in the last book, but in this book, I really loved that he was youthful and questioning. And I feel like that was so perfect for a youthful character, for a teenage character to question authority, to question things, to push back a little bit. And when he's talking to the guardsmen, or the people that are with him on that journey, they say, okay, well, that's nice that you're questioning, but if we had to choose sides, we would choose your father. Sorry, because he's the
Yeah.
Holy Prince or the Holy Prince of Light. So you come second to us. So he knows he's expendable compared to his father. And then when he undergoes that transformation, he's brought to awareness of the fact that it seemed to me, and tell me if you interpreted this differently or if I misinterpreted this, but I understood that he his coming into the way of danger of that fire by that creature, by that dragon spawn creature,
Right.
was in some ways, maybe an unconscious self-fulfilled prophecy, because in the back of his mind, he knew he did not feel aligned with being heir to this prince that he questioned. And
Yeah.
when he was in this spiritual, astral kind of realm, he was able to become conscious of the fact that he had this cognitive dissonance that
Hmm.
maybe in some way caused him to go against himself, self-sabotage.
Yep.
And as a result of becoming aware, and I love the Ask the Depth scenes in general in this series because there
Yeah.
is such a feeling of kindness, of compassion. Like it is safe to come to terms with those dark parts of yourself. It's safe to say this is the
Mm.
case. And so, because that could be very triggering to think, oh, I put myself in this situation and
Right.
I wasn't really comfortable with this situation. And I couldn't even admit it to myself. But he was able to, I think, in that space, feel comfortable, feel safe to acknowledge it and then take action in the direction that he felt was right for him. And I love how that's all tied into the metaphysics of this world with mage sight, which I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about mage sight in this book
Oh
as well.
goodness, we have to. Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautifully said. And when Kevor does save the girl from the wyvern and takes the fire, the later, as you said, the adept points out, and I think what's beautiful about the adept is the adept just puts this in front of Kevor and says, well, actually, there were these other things you probably could have done in this situation, and just allows Kevor then to process that and arrive there himself, right? The adept doesn't say, well, actually, you really screwed up there. You could have done this. And, it's done in such a gentle and non-invasive way. And that's, of course, what they're all about, is the adepts. And of course, Kevor becoming one himself by the end of this. That's quite a journey. AP, what are your thoughts on Kevor and this whole thread?
Do you remember back when Arathon tried to rescue the young girl who had been attacked?
Yes, with Dakar's help. With Dakar's help.
And she was offered the choice that in order to heal her, she had to accept that what she had done was wrong, and she had to allow all of this. And she, but if I do that, I am denying what I did, and I'm denying responsibility in my own choices. And I would admit those are my choices, and I stand by my choices. And so she is not healed.
True.
I think part of what I see here is an echo of that it's presented. There are all of these things, but he has the ability. Yeah, there were other things, but this is my choice. And he owns that. He goes, yes, but this is what I chose. And what I really like then is that this is almost a mirror, almost a direct mirror of Lyser.
Yeah.
Because Lyser sets himself up as holy, but he is profane in the meaning of secular, that he has set himself up as this false religion. And with his son, we see what Lyser could have been without the curse, because Lyser has been offered chance after chance to embrace living on this planet, to engage with the compact, to engage with the world. And he has refused it every time. He refused Ath's healing in that beautiful sequence. It still remains one of my favorite sections. He refused that. When put on trial by the Seven, he again refuses and denies them. And he constantly sees himself as apart from the world. And what we see his son do is his son embraces the world, embraces what all that means. And so he becomes really what Lyser could have been. He becomes an adept of Ath. He becomes part of this beauty, this metaphysical reality. What he transcends the petty physicality of the mundane and the profane. And so I thought it was just a wonderful way of giving us greater insight into Lyser, giving this moment that symbolically mirrors what Lyser could have been.
Yep.
And sets all of that up. So that's why that particular moment, and again, as Johanna pointed out, a phoenix born in flame, that cleansing fire, which of course, that idea of cleansing and the burning away of all of these things to emerge anew is what we see Arathon go through in a slightly different way, obviously later on, and we'll discuss that.
Yeah.
We see the same thing with Dakar. Giving himself over to something and being recreated, experiencing things beyond what he had thought was possible, and confronting his own limitations and being honest about his limitations. No self-mockery here, but actually understanding himself better, self-knowledge. And self-knowledge is so key at the heart of all of this. Arathon, Kevor, Dakar, the ability to embrace our mistakes, our darkness, the flaws in who we are, and not judge ourselves about it. Not be, and it's not to go, oh, well, I'm just like that, I'm just going to keep on doing that. It's being aware of it, being aware of who we are in our entirety, and going, well, that is who we are. What can we do going forward? And I think that's part of why this book is so much a pivot book, a fulcrum where we have now established what all of these flaws are, what all of these dark aspects of these characters. And now we're going to see moving forward the progress toward the resolution. And it's mirrored on this very human scale with the characters, but also the world, because we have seen all of the threats to the world and that this world is not perfect. The whole point, there's a wonderful line, I can't quite remember it, but it's Arathon remembers something that the master bard had said to him, that it's not about being mechanically perfect in music. It's not about the absolute perfection, because it is art, it is evocative, and it's about those frailties, those things that are not necessarily absolutely perfect, but they are evocative. And it reminded me of when we look at something that is hyper realistic and you see a photograph, you go, yeah, that's an apple. But then we can look at an impressionistic painting and it is not a perfect representation of an apple. And yet it speaks to a greater truth of that, because life is flawed. It's not about being absolutely pitch perfect in anything. That is artificial. We have to embrace the complexity and the fragmented nature of reality and these flaws in all of us and in the world around us, and move on and embrace the fact that we are imperfect, but try to be better. And so we see it on the very small scale with these characters. We see it with the world itself, with the threat of the wraiths, with Moriel and her schemes, with the Caradrim being freed, like everything. There are all of these threats, but this is part of the nature of the very reality that we are in. And we can't say that these do not deserve to exist. We have to find a way to incorporate them.
Yeah, beautifully said. And just to add to the pattern of Lyser's refusal, he, of course, in this book, very pointedly refuses the grace of the Paravian, the centaur, or the spirit of the centaur that is called up by Jirrit in that moment of Jirrit's transcendence, which we have to talk about, of course. But yeah, I mean, it's all over the place. Do we want to actually finish talking about Lyser before we move on to some other character? Thoughts on Lyser, Johanna, in here and his particular journey before we move on to some of the other characters that we should be focusing on?
I didn't feel like I got as big as this book was. I didn't feel like he was as central of focus as some of the other characters in, or as often as previous books. But I think that what I took from Lyser in this book, I just kept noting the contrast between him and Arathon. So, for example, whenever he is brought the news about his son dying, he takes that in for a moment. He starts to grieve for a moment, but it's like, oh, but what about, you got to keep your eye on the prize. You got to keep your eye on Arathon. And so right away, he just changes. He's like, okay, I'm done grieving. Let's focus on this. Whereas when Arathon is confronted with the idea of Jirrit passing away, he puts everything aside for that. So I felt like there was a strong contrast with that, as well as the contrast between the way that Lyser, there were specific scenes, I think with Sulfin. Is it Sulfin?
Sulfin Evand, yes.
Evand. Those were fantastic scenes. I thought were really interesting because it seemed it's always very clear in Lyser's perspective, but especially in those scenes, how he is willing to overlook things and manipulate things just to it's all about the ends justify the means, I guess. Is that the right way of saying it? Yes. Had to think about that for a second. And he's willing to manipulate things and use his crown power to do whatever he can to bring Arathon down. Whereas on the flip side, you have Arathon in this book really struggling with owning his crown title, his princely title or whatever. He really struggles with that. There were some really insightful passages about how he felt like he had to use it and he didn't like it. It made him feel grossed out, especially when he thought about people who've died for him, like Kale. And so he has this conflict with things, whereas Lyser seems to get by without having as much conflict with the same exact things. So that was something that stuck out to me with Lyser. And of course, the centaur scene, as you said, I'll be really honest. I much prefer, I understand the use of repetition for him to be confronted. Okay, let me put it this way. I preferred the fugitive prince at the Dept trial scene with Lyser. I preferred that scene over this one with the centaur. And part of me, when I was reading it, thought, okay, we're repeating the same thing. I already know what the answer is going to be. But at the same time, I do appreciate that this is being repeated, that he's being offered this choice again and again, because I think that that's true to this idea of consent. Like when it comes to the question of consent as the major balance is all about, offering choice, offering consent, it shouldn't just end. It doesn't, consent is ongoing. Like that's something that my husband talks about when it comes to like sexual misconduct, for example, or sexual engagement. Consent is not just, oh, they said yes once and that's it. It's ongoing. It's an ongoing conversation. So it makes sense that yes, he refused it at one point. Maybe things have changed. There always has to be the potential for change. So I did appreciate that that was brought up in this book. And it was, well, it was a good scene and everything. I just preferred the Fugitive Prince one because I thought that the setup was better. Whereas in this particular scene, I felt like it just shifted really fast to him going through these machinations in his mind, and then suddenly the centaur showing up. I didn't feel like it just felt like it wasn't gonna be a recipe for success the way it was in Fugitive Prince.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you could, I suppose, because the centaur is a being of such magnitude and coming from such a superior place, which of course is going to rub Lyser the wrong way. But it's interesting though that he does have a degree of self-awareness where he says essentially in that scene, if I'm wrong, I'm completely damned. If I'm wrong about Arathon, I am just completely damned. So I can't even go there. I can't even think that I'm wrong. I have to go ahead as if I were on the correct course. And so I can't repent now. I just can't. So anyway,
What he said, yeah, he said something like, if I'm wrong, I'm completely damned. But if I'm right, and then what is it? He said something like he's twice as damned
if I'm right and I do stop now, then I'm twice as damned. That's right.
Yeah.
Because and he does believe, I think, that he's light and good and justice and all of that. So AP, your thoughts on all this?
One of the things I'm reminded of is the fairy tale rule of three. Like Lyser rejected the offer with Af. He rejected the offer with the sorcerers. He rejects the offer of the Peruvians. Thrice rejected the rule of three. Each of these, it's not the same offer being made each time, although it pertains to the same thing, but it's each group saying, here is your chance. And he's now, I think, run out of chances.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting, it's not that his behavior changes and he continues to reject, just as Johanna pointed out about consent, but the rejection is continuous as well with Lyser. And what I find interesting is it has shifted each time the offer is being made by a different group representing this thing. And he is turning his back on each of them. And for this particular story, turning your back on both Ath and the Peruvians, that you have turned your back on these powers that are representative of the reality. And he turned his back and didn't recognize the power of the Brotherhood, who are the custodians of this. So he has nowhere else to go. So I find that quite interesting, and to tie into that sort of mythic structure of rejection and the offer, denying 3 times.
What did you all think about the alliance men like Sulfin who were in the presence of that Peruvian, brought to tears, and then after Lyser bears down and the centaur leaves, they just go on with Lyser? What did you all think about that?
Well, he had to beat them into it, and he said even to Sulfin Evan, anyone who shows any lack of dedication, who's still kind of softened up by this appearance of this Peruvian, have them go back and report to Itara. We can't have them along with us, because they won't be steady, they won't be reliable. So he it's almost like Satan in Paradise Lost at this point. It's just this
Mm.
willful, I know maybe I am damned, but I'm just going to keep on this course no matter what, and that's kind of, I feel like, what Lyser is doing there in forcing, using his charisma, using his power, using everything within his abilities to get these troops back to where he wants them to be, to wrest the narrative back into his control. That's what he's doing there, and he succeeds because he is that charismatic, and because those men have killed in his name. Those men have done horrible things in the name of the light. And if suddenly they realize that they were in the wrong all this time, like the one tracker who the Arathon shows empathy for, shows pity to, and he says, my God, I've been doing all this in the name of the light, and I've been committing wrong all this time. So for them to admit that, it's that's the thing about human beings. Once we do some stupid thing, we're very good at convincing ourselves that we were right to do it, and very bad at admitting that we were wrong. And so it's easier in a way for them to be convinced again by Lysair that no, this Paravian is a ghost. It's a force of evil. We have to get the spinner of darkness. Come on, let's get back on track. So I think that's my response to that it's understandable from a human psychological perspective.
Yeah. And that inability to admit when we are wrong and the difficulty that causes our conscience is, of course, why I've decided I am never going to be wrong. I just got to be right all the time. And then I never have to deal with it.
Once I thought I was wrong, but I was mistaken. Yes.
And Philip, I think you touched on a very important point there, which is Lysair is so much about control.
Yeah.
And yet the very nature of this world, the very nature of the magic of the spirituality of it, the metaphysics of it, is about acknowledgement of other people, acknowledgement of other people's choices. And in fact, it actually ties into a lot of what Arathon is experiencing. And it's a very difficult lesson for us to learn in real life. That trying to control others or take onto ourselves responsibility for what they chose to do, it's very natural to us. And one of the things that, from my own past, a very close friend of mine died, and I felt responsible. I felt guilt about this. I should have done more. No, this was my friend. The choices that they had made in their life led to this thing. It was not in my power to control. And yet I took that on myself. That's an incredibly selfish act. And the guilt I then felt about it was misplaced because I am denying the agency and power that my friend had in life. And I think that's part of the lesson that Arathon has to learn, where Lysair has embraced all of his power to try and control the narrative and embraced his title and tried to draw as much from it as possible. Arathon has been trying to avoid it, which is the same mistake, but in the opposite direction. He has not acknowledged his responsibilities and what he needs to do. And he has done this with various excuses. And he takes onto himself this pain and this suffering from these other people as if he is the one responsible for all of their choices. And again, that is ego. That
we see it when he realizes that he wanted to lose his mage sight, after the slaughter in Curse of the Mistwraith that ends that book. Arathon, his insight within Davian's maze, which we'll talk about again, is that just apropos of what you've been saying, AP. I mean, he realizes that he wanted to not have his maze sight, as a way of chickening out almost, and that he's punishing himself, right, for what happened there. So yeah, and that's really what you're saying is just so it's so profound and true, I think.
Yeah. I love that because again, I think it ties into what Kevor went through. I know we were talking about Kevor and Lyser, and that was a really cool insight, by the way, AP. But I was making a parallel in my mind with Kevor and Arathon too, with the mage sight, because whereas Kevor's mage, I imagine that is mage sight, right? Am I right about that? The sight that he does acquire after his eyes are burned. with his ability to see light, or is that something
Maybe.
different?
I know. I think you're
It
on.
could
Yeah,
be different.
I think no, not necessarily. Is it
That was
made
how I
sight
understood it.
that
That was how I
Kevlar?
understood it.
I don't think you're wrong. I'll put it that way.
But I did feel, well, we can at least say though that there was a connection between
Yeah.
relinquishing, or not relinquishing, it's more acknowledging our human condition, acknowledging or becoming aware of his cognitive dissonance, or ways that he wasn't really quite aligned morally in some way, and
Yeah.
not beating himself up, not denying it, not, but moving forward in the direction that he feels aligned, and that sight opening up for him. Whereas like the sight did have a parallel with Arathon, having that guilt, having that shame,
Yes.
getting rid of it, and then bringing it back after he restores himself
Yeah,
through
because
Davian's maze.
mage sight is the perception of the underlying connection in a way,
Mm.
isn't it? Of life,
Yeah.
of us being part of this vast web, and being able to see that connection both in terms of space and in time, the cause effect and all of that. So I think you're right that what Kevlar gains in becoming an adept is a form of mage sight, I think. Yeah. Do you have a thought on that, AP?
You could tell us AP if I'm wrong.
No. But made sight and all of these things, it's seeing deeper and seeing to the truth of things. At least it is to me. And the vision that people see of the world around us, we are seeing the surface level. And if you think about it in terms of physics, we are literally seeing the surface, because it's the light bouncing off the surface into our eyes. It is literally the surface level of the world. That is what we perceive.
Yep.
What I get a sense of, whether it is through a connection through Ath or through the understanding of magery and magic and all of this, to give that sight, to deeper see the truth of reality beyond the surface level.
Mm-hmm.
And whether it is mage sight or Ath sight, or an experience of opening up all of our senses to process all of the information that we are given, instead of a narrow focus on just that one element of the surface level information. And we have seen that with Sethvir's knowledge of the world.
Yes.
That, again, that is a form of the same thing, his deep connection through the world, that he is processing all of this information, every movement of every bird, every pebble. That is, again, it's a form of this sight. And we fixate on terms, I think, like sight, when it is about connection and understanding. And yeah, so I agree. It, a great way to describe it is it's a form of mage sight. But we have to understand that when we say mage, or I think we have to understand that when we say mage sight, it's not about just sight. It's about understanding and experiencing.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I totally agree. I totally agree with you. And I love the way that you're sharing that, because I feel that was one of the special things about Jarrett's mage sight description, is that we not only saw this high vibe, blissful view of what mage sight can bring, if we want to call it that, but we also saw the dark side of that, which is when you're really sensitive and open to understanding things, you also feel the pain that much more sharply. And which I feel he experienced through that as well. So it's almost like a double-edged sword in a way.
Yeah, in Jared's case, I think his ability to escape his physical body and the pain that he was in, and the fact that he was maimed by Sulfan Evand and Lyser in that way, was a key part of his transcending his body and being able to go outside that moment and see a vaster picture, a bigger picture, and to find peace in that. It's a very spiritual thing that he undergoes, to be able to say, yeah, he's grieving, his life is essentially over. He knows it. He knows there's a lot of pain in front of him, that he's going to be in for a rough time here. But he's able, in the most beautiful way, there's such heroism to Jared's story here in this book. There's such beautiful heroism, and it's not physical at all. It's a spiritual heroism, and I love that. That what we have with Jared's arc here is complete transcendence. In that moment, he makes a sacrifice for Arathon, knowing that he's probably not going to survive this, and Arathon had even, hoped that for him that he would not get captured, because that's the worst thing that could happen. And of course it happens, right? But then he is, with the aid of it's Trace Raven, I guess, that comes to him, right? That
Mhm.
takes him on this journey and gives him this perspective of mage sight, seeing into the connection of all life, and being able to see that greater perspective allows him to be removed from his physical body and the pain of the moment, in order to see a truer, vaster, vision that gives him peace and reconciliation to his situation. And he also has that parting gift, which Lysair refuses, which I thought was so compassionate and beautiful, that his calling upon the Paravian allows this situation where the Paravian gives Lysair this ultimatum, this choice again. And of course, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And
That's perfect. That's the perfect saying for that.
yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
anyway, thoughts on
There's
that?
I was about to say, there's another saying that comes to mind, particularly about Lysair and that particular group, which is ignorance is bliss.
Yeah.
There is there is peace and security in the simplicity of ignorance.
Right.
And the more you know, the more that you understand, the more complicated you realize that the world is, the more frightening it can be, the more difficult it can be. And yet the ignorance is not the truth. It is such a small element, and that complexity, that thing that we need to embrace, the thing that is beyond all of us. Like no one can understand the true complexity of everything. It's beyond human comprehension.
Yeah.
But to deny that it exists, to want to live in ignorance, because that is too frightening, that is too complicated, that is too much. But this is part of what I think we strive for.
Yeah.
We know we're imperfect. We will never have a perfect understanding, but we strive for better understanding. And the Peruvians know that humankind is flawed. The Peruvians understand that. They know that we will make missteps. But the point is to try to learn and to try to grow and to try to carry on. And I think that is a very important lesson for Arathon in this.
It's also a lesson that Moriel, or Celody as she's now called, she's taken over that body, doesn't seem to heed very well either. And I'm pretty sure she won't ever want to go to a barbecue again.
Lots of fire in this particular
Oh
book.
my goodness. I mean, she does get outfoxed by Davian there, doesn't she?
Yeah.
And using her own tools against her, and fooling her essentially into sacrificing her arms in order to reestablish control over her crystal there. But AP?
Well, I was about to say, but the for me, one of the major important aspects of that entire sequence,
Yeah.
she judged Davian's actions based on what she would do.
Yes.
Because she never considered that there is no way that Davian, even Davian the betrayer, there's no way he would unleash that kind of destruction on the world. Like, that is not who the Seven are, even this mysterious member. They are not that. But that's who she is. That's the risk that she would run. And
Yeah.
so she leaps in to do this because obviously that's what's going to happen. And yet, no, Davian would never have allowed that to happen. Fail-safes were in place, and all she had to do was wait. All she had to do was better understand the world, better understand the people in the world, and not be locked into that one way of perceiving. And she doesn't open herself up to that. She is convinced she is right. Like Lyser, she has this very narrow vision and will not consider opening her eyes to other ways of seeing.
Yeah. And
For
she takes
all
it
of
out
her
on
power.
Lyrenda as well. Lyrenda's not in a very good spot.
No.
Not that I feel entirely sorry for Lyrenda either, because obviously she's acting out of pride and arrogance and selfish motives. But she's basically going to be her Celody's right arm and left arm, from now on. Yeah. literally without any volition of her own. So that was an interesting thread, I thought. But
And again, we see that element of domination, of control,
yes.
of enforcing your will on others, and how that is the antithesis of keeping the world in balance and acknowledging everyone and everything's place in the world. It's this world is here to serve me.
Mm.
I am the hero of the story. I am the main character. This world should bend to my will instead of finding our place. And it's not know your place, it's finding our place in relation to everyone because we are all part of it.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a tension that's explored because with well, we can talk about it in terms of Arathon's trial later. We can get
Which
there.
we will do. Yeah. Very good. Yeah. Before we move on to Arathon and Elaira and those, I feel like we should finish on that because that's probably the heart of this book. Perhaps we could talk about the Fellowship of the Seven and their efforts to contain the damage and basically preserve life on Athera. Focused mainly on Dakar's role there in keeping the Mist Wraith contained, and Fionn Areth and his interesting little, he has some eye-opening moments as well there as they're trying to aid Luhane and Caradmon in the scene there at the mountain where they're trying to reestablish the wards, and finally with the I don't know how to explain exactly, but the big wave of power that's coming down was it the sixth, I think,
Sixth lane.
the sixth lane. I
Yeah,
think it was a sixth. But
maybe.
they knew they weren't going to make it, and it was Caradmon who calls upon Arathon to save the day, which of course involves a huge sacrifice on Arathon's part, but it's tapping into his Master Bard magic that allows him to put things back in tune, literally. So thoughts on Dakar and Fionn Areth and Luhane and Cardman and all of that, these efforts to contain the damage and the Mist Wraith. Johanna, you want to go first on that?
I'm trying to think of where to start with that. I think what was most interesting to me about having Arathon claim his title as a royal prince was one, how that was set up. I love the way that was set up because that was
Really
I
good.
noticed that a moment before that in the book was when Arathon was grappling with his heir title and about how he had to use that to get the scout to go a certain direction because he didn't want to be responsible for this scout's death in
Yeah.
the way that but he also resents the fact that people would call him my liege or something like that or
Yeah.
whatever title they used. So he was upset about that. He felt conflicted about that, and that's there's so much about Arathon having to own his power, having to step into himself in this particular story. So
Hmm.
I did note that. And then the other part of that was I noticed that the dialogue in that part, and I wish I had this written down somewhere. I probably do somewhere, but there was a dialogue section in that particular part where Arathon is being asked, oh yes, okay, I do have it written down here. The land knows your name. Draw on your blood heritage.
Ah,
We all have no choice. Interesting dialogue there. I I find that line interesting though about how the land knows your name because I feel like there are even more hints in this book about rocks and crystals being sentient and um and how there was even a line in this book at some point where it said Earth was not blind to the wars that happened or the destruction that mankind did. So I feel like there's this interesting sentience um, subtlety going on
yeah.
with
Well, the
the earth,
mountain itself has to,
the mountain. Thank you. Yes, the
yeah,
mountain itself,
the mountain
Rockfell. Yeah,
itself, Rockfell
Mhm.
has to give consent for them to
Yeah.
contain all those wards and everything. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, that was fascinating. Thank you for remembering that. But
Yeah.
yes, that was what came to mind um, in that
Brilliant.
particular scene.
AP, any thoughts on all that?
I think Joanna pretty much summed it up.
Yeah.
Not in a very articulate way, but thank you.
But with that particular sequence, again, the whole "you're not my real dad" kind of attitude of a stroppy teen who is again so sure,
Theon,
so
yeah.
absolutely positive that they know, they understand. And
Yeah.
he's sitting with this person who, yeah, is a drunkard, but is hundreds of years old,
Right.
speaking to these disembodied sorcerers who are thousands upon thousands of years old. But yeah, he knows the truth.
Of
Right.
course he
And
does.
again, that blindness, that ignorance, that willingness to deny the other perspectives who may know more. It doesn't mean that they are always right, but using their perspective gives us greater perspective. And then in seeing this prison, which to be honest is a stopgap measure,
Yeah.
this is not a solution. Um, the Mistwraith, the Mistwraith contained there, yes, is external to this world, but something needs to be done because containing them is not a solution. The Grimwards are not a solution. They are a temporary stopgap measure that is cordoning off pieces of the world to say, we'll just contain it for a while. That's not embracing, finding a way to blend them into the reality of the world.
Right.
And so I find it fascinating that we're seeing all of these examples of chopping up the world and trying to contain elements we don't like, elements that don't fit neatly, instead of trying to find a way for them to blend into the harmony of the reality.
Yep.
Um,
It's like
and
burying your nuclear waste deep underground, right? Yeah.
That's
I don't bury my nuclear waste deep underground.
Oh.
Philip, how could you do that? You're a terrible person.
Yeah.
So
Well,
can we bring some clarification for me because I still had a hard time understanding all the connections here. And thank you for talking about the wards. The grimoire, the wards are a temporary solution to keeping the wraith spirits in place from
the
invading
dragons, well, the grimoires are
dragon.
the memories of the dragons, which are so powerful that if they were unleashed on the world, it would make life uninhabitable. Everyone would go crazy.
Okay,
That's
yeah.
what the grimoires are.
Yeah.
Oh,
Whereas
okay.
the Mistwraith is contained in Rockfell. And just to complicate it further, Cardman has been occupied keeping other wraiths out from the other
Merrick.
world. Yes, Marek,
Mhm.
exactly. Yeah.
And again, they're encasing the world in wards and
Wow.
almost separating off Athera from the universe.
Yeah.
And again, I think like all of these things, there are stopgap measures. And we might say, oh, but the Grimwards have been there for thousands of years. And you go, but in the grand scheme of eternity,
Mm,
1,000 years is a stopgap. 10,000 years is a million years might be a stopgap. But again, we are operating within the limits of our knowledge. And even
right. Right.
the seven, like um they might have almost incalculable power and all of this wisdom and experience, but it's still a limited perspective. And Davian was one of my favorite characters to be explored here.
Oh yeah, I thought you would like him.
I
Um,
loved him.
and for one of the things that I thought was absolutely wonderful, Davian can move between being a spirit and being physically embodied,
Yeah.
which the others have not learned how to do.
He's
And it was
clever.
because he got bored being a spirit. So he thought his way out of it and found a way to embody himself. The others have not thought of that. He separated himself from the others, and it turns out he was willing to do that. He had plans. He disagreed with what the others were doing. It seems that he had something to do with the downfall and the breaking up of the lineage of kings that led to this current situation.
Right.
But Davian seems to be the most farsighted of all of them, even if he is slightly pragmatic might be a very kind way to put this.
Yeah.
But if that situation is not the natural end state, if that is again a stopgap measure that may last 15, 25, 100,000 years, but what's beyond that? And I think for someone like Davian, it's okay, well, this will work in the meantime, but that's not the solution. That is a stopgap measure. Everything I think for Davian is he's trying to see a way to create a solution to the problems that works. And I find him it's slightly caustic sense of humor is as well. I quite like that.
Yeah,
Mhm.
no, he's fascinating. He's definitely cocky and clever, and not trustworthy, according to any of the other of the Fellowship. I mean, no, they do not trust him,
I
clearly.
know, but hang on, are any of them trustworthy?
Well, that's a legitimate question for sure. But all the others agree that Davian is not. So So I like him too. I think he's a fascinating character. He's a trickster in a way. He does see things that others. He's a bit of a. He's not quite like a Saruman type figure, but he definitely is in love with his cleverness, and he does create these interesting constructs in order to bring about his will, such as the whole maze that we're going to talk about eventually that Arathon has to get through. I think we should finish on that.
Yeah.
But
And the 5th-century fountain.
yes, which
Oh,
is
that's right.
responsible for
Yeah.
their long lives. Yeah.
Think of his interaction as the eagle. What's Arathon's girlfriend called?
Ilera.
Ilera.
Sometimes names just pop out of my head. But in his interaction with her, he treats with her with
Yes.
respect as an equal, and he is honest.
But he's also
not
using her the whole time to get at to get at Moriel, isn't he?
Well, you know, you can have more than one reason to do something.
Oh, he knew very well what would happen, and it worked. Like he saw he was playing multi-dimensional chess. Yeah.
I think I do remember something about that now that you say that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he doesn't treat her badly. He doesn't
No.
lie to her.
Yeah.
Yes.
And he gives her the options. Now, just if you give someone options and you know for a fact they're going to choose that thing and you can count on that, that doesn't mean you're not giving them the option.
Right. But he was also using her at the same time.
Using or helping facilitate a way forward. Like there are so many different ways that we could phrase this, Philip.
Yeah. No, I think he's a brilliant character. I love this element of this. I'm so glad we met this character. And
me too.
Dying to know what his game plan is, and I don't think he's evil. I would not call him evil, but I would call him untrustworthy and interesting.
That's because you always leap to judgments and think the worst of people, Philip. That's what we all know about you.
That's me, all right.
I keep on thinking though that we're set, and who knows what's going to happen. There could be a lot of twists and turns I don't see, but I keep feeling like we're set up to look at him as, he's Davian the betrayer. He's so bad. And I love that we saw the side of him that, he did treat Ilera respectfully, even if he did use her.
Well, and ultimately too, he turns Arathon into the tool that is needed to save Athera by having him go through this maze. So he may have been right all the time. He even says it himself. I'm either going to destroy him or I'm going to make him into the tool that we all need, and almost as if, because there's one of the Fellowship of the Seven that's actually missing. We don't know where he is. I forget his name, but he's gone, right? Is Arathon going to become, is he going to be able to take his place? Because he seems to be incredibly gifted, incredibly powerful, but he was denying a lot of that power because of his compassion and his guilt and everything else. So it seems to me Davian's plan is to, for whatever reason, get Arathon in touch with the full extent of his power, right? And it works, but yeah. But in the meantime, though, you brought up Ilera and her interactions with Davian and her choice to observe Arathon during his moment of trial, and her desperate need to walk this tightrope where she doesn't allow herself to offer him aid because that would put him in debt to the Coriathane, to Moriel, and that's what Moriel wants. She's hoping that all this time Ilera will do that. I guess we can talk about Ilera now if you guys want.
I have a few things to say about that, and I'll first go back to something we've already talked about, which is Lorenda, because I feel like seeing what Lorenda goes through with that punishment raises the stakes of in my mind, it raised the stakes of like, wow, like this is what's at stake if Arathon gets tied up into some Coriani oath trap, or or Loren or Ilera too. So I just wanted to point that part out before.
Yeah, good. That's very important. Yeah.
The way you phrased that, John, I was like, well, I have things to say. Oh, I'm gonna smack her around. I don't like. I thought that's where you were going with all of this. I was going, what did she do?
What, Ilera? Oh no,
Yeah,
I love
I
Ilera.
have some things to say about that.
No, no. No, no. But
That's a good
I
observation.
I will say though that the unicorn scene was amazing. That might have been my favorite scene in the whole book, to be honest. I
Well,
loved it.
Alera undergoes a spiritual transformation when she reaches the adepts as well. She's in one of their what is it called?
Hostels.
Not a chapel, but one of their
Hostels.
hostel. Thank you.
Hostel, yes.
She's in the hostel. I want to get your thoughts, you two, on her transformation as she enters this hostel and makes these decisions, these very important decisions in regard to herself and Arathon. So who wants to go first on
I want to go first, if that's okay.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm sure AP will have a lot to say as well. I loved this beginning section with her journey at the hostel and all the conversations she was having with that at the depth.
Yeah.
Such beautiful, so many beautiful quotes in that particular section.
Yep.
And they were so relevant to what happens to Arathon. Even though we're talking to Alera, it echoed back whenever we went through Arathon's journey at the end. There were these conversations about true power and about wakened knowledge of self is true power, and that the power isn't necessarily outside of you, where she felt like her power came from the Coriathane or Coriani. And he said, no, not all your power comes from that. And that was enlightening to her. So she starts to awaken to that. But I feel like even though these messages were for her, to me, like I said, I feel like they coincide with what Arathon has to learn too about power, about acknowledging himself, about that journey of self. So I thought that was beautiful. And then the unicorn scene was just magnificent. I teared up. I I thought it was so gorgeous because how many fantasy stories have a are written about a unicorn? And The Last Unicorn by Beagle, an all-time favorite, one of my favorites. I reread that earlier this year. And there are so many great, great stories, great passages about unicorns, but no one can write a unicorn passage quite like Janny Wurts, I have to say. That was absolutely stunning. So beautiful, so powerful.
That was my first moment in reading this book where I just had to put the book down and like, just, can I be here forever, in this moment of bliss and transformation and transcendence? It was really stunning, as you said. Yeah. AP, thoughts on Ilera?
Well, just to talk about that for a second. Sometimes people confuse not liking a style with bad writing. And I think what we're just discussing here is the fact that at the very start of this book, there are all of these relevant dialogues that are very relevant, these points being made between that character and the situation they're in, that tie in so exactly with how this book ends. And you go, that is good writing, regardless of whether or not you enjoy the style. Style is a different thing. The fact that these situations that feel natural in that moment, and yet they play out on macro and micro scales and foreshadow other events. This is an author in true command of her writing.
Yeah.
Her choice to write in a more poetic style may not be to everyone's preference, and that is absolutely fine. But this is where I get so irritated. Well, it's just bad writing. You shouldn't do that. You should make it simpler. And you go, you know what? Go and tell an impressionist artist, oh, you should make it more realistic. Go away. I get so frustrated with this.
I like how this turned into a rant. Sorry, go ahead.
With art, we can point to all of these different styles, and it is easy to recognize cubism, impressionism, expressionism, like abstract, photorealistic. We can point, and it's easy to notice this. Philip and I were discussing how a story being told in the mythic mode, rather than standard straightforward fantasy, in the mythic mode. And all of these people were like, well, I just think that's a cop-out. Oh, it's not real. That's just an excuse for bad writing. And I swear to all that is holy in this world that if people don't know about different forms of narrative, can they please not make comment about things they don't understand? Engage with things, express why you don't like or why you do like something. I always encourage that. But one of the things that the internet has allowed is for us to have curiosity and find people who can explain things that maybe we were unaware of instead of denying their existence.
Imagine Fionn Earth on the internet.
It is so frustrating to me to see, oh, that's just bad writing. You shouldn't write that way. You go, look at what is done with this writing. Look at the expressions. Look at the emotion. Look at how it ties together. Look at how there is harmony. Oh my God, the concept of harmony that comes up time and time again in these books. This is about creating resonance and harmony.
Yeah.
And it is so powerfully done. That does not mean that it is to everyone's taste, which is absolutely fine. No one is saying you have to enjoy it, you have to like it. But for those of us that do, that talk about these things, we're not making it up.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm sorry for that rant. It frustrates me because if I went around saying to people who liked something I didn't, oh, well, you're just an idiot. That's just copium. You're just making excuses because that thing is bad. Everyone would quite rightly go, AP, you're being an arrogant ass. And yet, for some reason, people in the comments of YouTube videos decry these things all the time. And if we deigned to so eloquently put it as, stop being an arrogant ass, we are the ones being judgmental. And oh, it irritates me.
Yeah.
I love how we're talking about a unicorn scene that's so beautiful and all these dragon fireballs just
Fireballs
get burst out.
incoming. Yeah. No, you're right, AP. Everything you said is correct. That is true. That and especially what you were saying about this is a writer in complete command of her story. And the fact that all these transformations, I think, are in a way telling us more and more about what is going to be happening with Arathon. And this is the climax, really, of this book, is Arathon's. Are you guys ready to go there? Are we ready to go to Davian's maze? Yeah, let's do it. I think we've covered most of the major threads. I feel like I'm forgetting a couple people here or there. So if you think of someone that we have neglected, by all means, bring them up. But I'm ready to start talking about Arathon here. We've talked about all the people who made sacrifices, all the people who've contributed to his placement in Davian's maze, including Davian himself, who seems to be nudging things along here in various ways. Let's not forget Jirrit and his sacrifice and his role in getting him there. Ilera, as she's witnessing him. And there's a beautiful moment when they actually do realize he realizes she's there and they communicate without her tipping off Moriel / Celody. Yeah, there's just a lot going on here in this, that a lot of things have converged into this moment of Arathon. I feel like ever since Curse of the Mistwraith, we've been waiting for this moment, actually, of Arathon having to confront all these truths, to experience all these deaths, to feel what it's like to die over and over and over again, to be in the other person's shoes with his gift of empathy in full employ the whole time. And to have this essentially be the moment when he must transcend what he has been. Either that or perish. Those are the two alternatives as he's here. So, yeah, what are your thoughts on him reliving all the trauma from the first 5 books and his journey in this maze and what it does, what it accomplishes? Who wants to go first and talk about Arathon?
Go ahead first, AP.
One of the things that occurred to me when I was reading this, that identifying pattern that Philip spoke about earlier, about, it seemed a lot of the same things were happening, and here we get and you could almost think of it, oh, it's a recap of all of this stuff. Why are we reading it again? But this is part of the re-experiencing. And in one of the Malazan novels, there's a sequence of called The Chain of Dogs. And a number of people have said it didn't have to be as long. It didn't need to do it all of these different times. And clearly, Erickson in the case of The Chain of Dogs and Wurts in the case of this particular sequence went, no, this sequence lasts exactly as long as I think it needs to be.
Yeah.
Whether that matches our own personal choice and personal preference, that's different. And that's why we know people say, oh, it was a slog, it dragged on too long. It dragged on too long for you. It's not necessarily that it dragged on too long, because we individually are not the arbiters of the perfect length of an emotional experience that is represented in fiction. But with this, we have this moment. There was a short story, and for the life of me, I've completely forgotten the author and title of it. But the story is, the premise of it is, there is only one soul on Earth, and this soul inhabits the body of a person. And then when they die, they have experienced everything that person experienced. And then when they die, they go back and they experience the next person. So they're going to experience the life of every single person on the planet until the end of time. And then at the end of time, they will be the sum of all human experience. That's what I feel that part of what is being explored here is that we are both singular individuals, but we are part of a pattern that interacts in a complex web of interactions. And we are not the ones in control of everything, except as far as everyone has that same level of control. And it is a very difficult concept to articulate and to wrap our heads around, about our place in the melody of life. And accepting that everyone else has responsibility for their own choices and actions, just as we have responsibility for our choices and actions, that we are not all perfect, and that hiding behind false modesty or guilt or running away from our responsibilities because, oh, we don't want to be a bother to people, it's finding that moment between, the balance point between being in imposition and not imposing enough. The golden path, exactly the one balancing point of life where we acknowledge our strengths and our weaknesses, where we learn from our mistakes but are not beholden by our mistakes, where we aim for the future but we are not driven to forget the present moment. That is so difficult to achieve. That is almost like a moment of true transcendence, to be able to do all of that. And we are imperfect. We are going through a process of trying, and we may never succeed. But just because we may never succeed doesn't mean that we don't try. And with Arathon finally accepting that he has been rejecting his power, just as much as Lyser has been reveling in the abuse of his power, that Arathon has been taking on to himself responsibility for what everyone else has been doing and thought and believed and agreed to, just as Lyser is denying responsibility for all of these things. And accepting, and I don't know if this is maybe taking it too far, but the Mistwraith curse that is in him is not an entirely separate entity. It is part of him now. And he has to accept that. He has to find a way to live with that. He has to find a way to be, because this is part of him. It isn't just an external force. This is something that is now through him.
Yeah.
And it's not to give over all will to it, but it's also not to just oppose it. We cannot oppose pieces of ourselves. We have to find a way to achieve balance.
Yeah.
And part of what was going through this is when we think then of that on a more abstract notion, where we so often externalize the bad and, oh, this was because of this thing, instead of accepting that that was actually part of us, that this is almost a literalization of that we project the badness or why things happen. Oh, that bad thing, that thing over there, it's external to me, instead of acknowledging that it was partly our fault, or partly something that we did, or part of us.
Bit like Ged at the end of A Wizard of Earthsea, right? Similar moment, I would say. But yeah, you said so many beautiful things there, AP. There's he gets through this trial, but he doesn't do it alone, does he? I mean, he has all the memories of his grandfather and his grandfather's strictures and his wisdom that are pulling him through. He has Alera, who is witnessing and is making her presence felt, and motivating him as well, because he's not just surviving for his own sake. He has to do it for her because she's there too, so he can't give up. But then even later, there's the little girl that he tried to save, whose spirit comes to help him. There's the Paravian who comes to help him as well, to accept himself, as you say, right? So much of this trial is about accepting himself and all his complicated parts. So yeah, it's just really
Well,
interesting,
as Dunn said, no man is an island unto himself.
right?
And he had been holding himself apart. And yet all of these spirits, these shades, these people come forward to go, no, what you did is important to me, and it was my choice, and you helped me. Just as you're involved in the repercussions that are negative, there are positive repercussions as well. That life is a balance of this. And so he has to accept who he is. He has to be that island, but he has to accept that his island is connected in this grand world. And Lyser cuts himself off. He cuts himself off and orders others. Arathon ran away and didn't want to ever order anyone. And again, those extreme positions are untenable. They are unnatural. But finding that middle ground, which, I keep saying is extraordinarily difficult. We usually step too far one way or too far another.
Yeah.
But trying to find that balance point of recognizing our impact on others and what we are responsible for, but also acknowledging their power and autonomy and their decisions that brought them to that moment as well. That is not on us.
Yeah.
And we can help or we can hinder. There are beautiful things that come from our actions, and there are unforeseen terrible things that have come from our actions. And that is the mystery of life.
Indeed. Johanna, I want to hear all your thoughts on Arathon's journey through the maze of Davian.
I really love that we started out in this particular part with the memories of himself as a small child, discovering the shadow. And I also appreciated that in this sort of life review section that we're having, as you were discussing the part of seeing all the people that he maybe that died, due to him, I guess, or whether he was witness to or that he was a cause of, that it wasn't just that, and coming to grips with that, and also recognizing their part as well. But I also really appreciated that he was able to see through his grandfather's eyes and recognize that his grandfather did what he did because he loved him and he was trying to do right by him, but he couldn't know that as a small child. And I think that's somewhat realistic for many of us. Not, some of us, our parents weren't perfect just in some cases, or maybe they did make the right choice, whatever reason it was. Sometimes we can't understand that when we're young. And then later on in life, we look back and we start to put ourselves in their shoes and we start to understand that better. But I felt like that was a really powerful scene for him to be able to come to grips with that. I also appreciated that we really understood in more depth, or it was just more clear or obvious, I would say. I think there were kind of hints of this before about the parasitic nature of this curse, that like AP said, that it's a part of him now. It's not something he could just separate himself from. It's not something he can necessarily be totally rid of, but that he has to learn to live with it. And I feel like this all kind of goes back to me to book 1, where I remember when I first learned about Arathon, something that is said in book 1 is how his name means, and I'm sure it's in the glossary too, forger of fate. So that, that comes full circle, I think, when the centaur tells him that. It says you need to claim your own destiny here. And I know earlier AP was talking about the scene in the sequence with Halaron. Is that his name?
Yes, the Master Bard.
The Master Bard. And memories about being a true musician and artist and letting go of perfection. there was something in that passage that also reminded me, oddly, of a music masterclass that I attended a couple of years ago. Do you know the violinist Hilary Hahn?
Of course.
Yes, I got to see a masterclass with her a couple of years
Wow.
ago.
Huh.
And one thing that she did with each musician, young, college musician she worked with, was she asked them, tell me something that you love about your playing. And with every person, they really struggled. I mean, these are really well-trained musicians, excellent violinists. I mean, they performed so beautifully. And then when asked, name something that you appreciate about how you play, how you play violin or how you play music or about yourself as a musician, they struggled to answer it. And she said that she's done, master classes obviously all over the world. And she always asks this question in every master class. And every time whoever she's working with struggles to answer that question.
Wow.
And I feel like I just felt that whenever he was hearing Halloran's wisdom, learning to take ownership of this part of himself, or being able to see that true part of himself, not only to acknowledge that he's not perfect, but also to acknowledge what is good about him and being able to own that.
Yeah.
And I think there was an honesty in Arathon in this whole section about how he really doesn't want this. I mean, that's been coming through, like I said, throughout this story, how he doesn't really want to be heir. He doesn't want this title. He just wants to play his music. His perfect life would be to be rid of the curse, to live his best life with Alara. And then he reminds himself, but Alara's not free either. Alara's bound to the Coriani. And so I find that really a fascinating thing in this series is that as much as we have the major balance and this idea of consent and this aspect of choice, at the same time, this is counterbalanced by the fact that if you're living with a curse, there's only so much you can do when it comes to that. If you're bound or oath bound to this sisterhood, especially when you were bound as an orphan, as a child, there's not much. Alara does find that she does have power she didn't know about, but there are challenges with that. There are strings to that. And same with the fellowship. The fellowship have certain parameters around being a fellowship sorcerer. I don't know, I guess that all that came to mind as certain things that stood out to me in that particular section. But I did really appreciate that this section does deal with trauma and with guilt and integration. It really did feel like a therapeutic healing journey, as difficult as it was. But I'll be honest. I mean, and I'm going to be honest because I totally agree with AP. Like, you can't say that this is bad writing. Like, this is a woman, a writer who is in command of her craft. I totally agree with that. But I'll be honest, like, enjoyment wise, this is not the same as me saying it's good or bad. Enjoyment wise, I did struggle through this section. I was not personally enjoying my experience rereading all these sequences. And I did not particularly care personally, subjectively, for Alara's cry mercy 27 times in this section. But
Did you
at the
actually
same
count?
time, what?
Did you actually count?
I have an ebook and I looked it up
Oh, okay.
because
Yeah.
I was like, this is going on. How many times is she saying that? There was a use of the repetition again in italics. I liked that use of repetition. I thought
Deliberate.
that was excellent in building a forward momentum in that section. But it could be my internal narrator. My internal narrator with the cry mercy just sounded, it just didn't work for me. I'm sorry. This is just
Okay.
me. So I'm just owning that. And I know I'm safe to own that because I'm not saying that it's bad writing. I'm just saying I personally did not like it.
I would
But
say in response to that, Joanna, is it read slowly for me, but I will never forget reading this section. Like, I'm pretty
mm,
sure and if I'm around in 30 or 40 years, one of the things I will most vividly remember about this series is that scene, is that sequence. And I will remember the phrase "cry mercy" along with it. But yes, I agree with you that it does read slowly, and it's not easy. It's difficult.
And I don't think slow is bad. Like I
Yeah.
enjoy slow, what others people consider slow.
Yeah.
Often I don't even notice it's slow, but just for me, but at the same time, all
Yeah.
that said, there were a lot of moments that I did emotionally connect to.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I really appreciated what it was doing with the story and what it meant for Erathon's transformation.
Yeah.
I did appreciate all of that. And I'm sure there's even more to appreciate that I might not even be aware of that'll come forward in future books. So it's just a little mix for me as far as that's concerned, but I did appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we'll be wrapping things up here, but are there any things that we haven't mentioned that either of you want to bring up before we finish?
Well, just on the point that Johanna raised, that
Right back.
like I agree. Like you're reading through that, and it can feel repetitious. It is reinforcing and repeating and doubling down on the breaking down of Arathon and what he went through, and the fact that anyone observing that, how much more can someone take? And like we are in that position of viewing it. And that was part of the point that I was trying to make with the comparison to Chain of Dogs, is that sometimes when we're reading through sequences like that, we go, yeah, I got it at this point. I don't need 90 other times. But one of the things that made this so impactful for me, and why, like even as I was going through it, and I was going, oh, again, but the ending of it suddenly made all of those things important. And the moment was that Philip had mentioned earlier, when Arathon is comforting the dying soldier, and the dying soldier has that epiphany. And that moment changed retrospectively my view of what we had gone up to that moment, because without that journey, I don't think that moment would have had the same impact for me. If I hadn't been following along with this, if I hadn't understood all of these things, if I hadn't been reminded of how much he had been stretched and abused, to then in that moment to forgive essentially an enemy, to give comfort and aid and succor to an enemy, that all of that repetition was necessary to create the foundation for why that moment stands out so strongly. For other people, it may be too much. It may be too much repetition. But for me, in seeing that, it was taking me right to the brink where I went, see if there's one more instance of him that only barely being able to go on, because but it ended at that exact moment where we didn't have yet one more, because it ended on that moment with the soldier.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
So
that was brilliant. Yeah.
It's like I completely and utterly understand people saying it was too much, it was too repetitious. You go, yeah, because we are all different readers. We all respond to things in a different way.
Yeah.
But that moment with the tracker that Arathon connected with, and whose eyes were opened in his very last moment, realizing, oh, I thought I was following the light. I thought I was doing the right thing. The fact that she ended on that, I think you're so right, AP. That was just perfection there. Yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah. One thing I wondered about, well, I guess it doesn't matter because I think that's perfect. Yeah. I don't think it, I guess one thing that did cross my mind after I finished all that was, it's interesting that Lorenda is completely omitted from that whole sequence, because man, she suffers a lot because of Arathon. And I guess that's seen as her own fault, but I can't help but feel for Lorenda a little bit. I mean, she's punished because she, I guess, fell for the trap of letting them go at the end of the last book.
You're gonna reap just what you sow.
Oh man.
Poor Lorenda. I do feel a little bad for her too, but yeah.
I could posit a theory why she wasn't there.
Go for it.
She's bound to the Coriani. None of them, with the exception of Alira, who is connected in a completely different way, but none of them are there. None of
That's
because they're
true.
separate, they're bound by a different oath. They are outside of this thing.
Mm,
And
that's true.
whether or not that is sufficient explanation, or it's because she's not dead yet, and it was the dead that were appearing.
That's
But
true. Good point. That's a good point. Yeah, a
Hmm.
good point. And I don't think the fellowship are either. And not to say, I mean, he obviously seems to be the way that things are being presented, it seems like he's aligned with the fellowship, but I don't know. It sounds like they're also really struggling through all that, trying to help him keep him alive.
Well, it's going to be fascinating to see how this develops from here because, where do we go from this elevated place where this book ends? Of course, the struggle continues, between light and shadow, and all of that, and Lyser's pursuit of Arathon. But Arathon has really been transformed by this, whereas Lyser turned down his opportunity to transform in this book. And that's going to have repercussions, obviously. But it'll be interesting to see the role that Arathon will be playing in the future. I'm excited to read Traitors Not. It's the next book in the series, which will be hosted by Johanna.
AP.
Oh,
No,
AP.
I think it's AP. Yeah, because I hosted the last one.
Okay. AP will be hosting our discussion of Traitors Not. So that'll be fantastic. So thank you both. Once again, this has been enlightening. This has been fun. I enjoy your fellowship so much. And everybody for watching this, thank you for sticking around. And hopefully we will see you at the next discussion over at A Critical Dragon. But for now, so long, my friends. And till next time.